In 2007, Fox looked at a pilot for an animated comedy and decided the show was too offensive to put on television. The pilot was called Brickleberry. The same network that was, at that exact moment, airing Family Guy on Sunday nights had decided that this other show had crossed a line their own flagship had never crossed. Brickleberry would eventually find a home at Comedy Central 5 years later, run for 3 seasons, and disappear. Almost nobody remembers it now. That story is one of about a dozen like it from the strangest 15-year stretch in American adult animation. After Family Guy came back from cancellation in 2005, every network in the business spent the next 2 decades trying to build their own version. Almost all of them failed. Some of them failed so badly the networks pulled the shows off the internet entirely. Tonight, we go through every single one of them. Welcome to Red Umbrella. Let's get started. The conditions that created the wave. Family Guy's 2005 resurrection and the adult animation gold rush. Before any of the shows in this video could exist, something genuinely strange had to happen first. A show had to die, get buried, and then crawl back out of the ground. Family Guy premiered on Fox on January 31st, 1999, right after the Super Bowl. That is the kind of slot a network only gives you when they think they have a hit on their hands, and Fox was not wrong to think that. Seth MacFarlane was 25 years old when the show went on air. He had pitched the original idea as a 15-minute pilot back in 1998, built around a redesigned version of 2 cartoon shorts he had made earlier in his career, called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve. Larry became Peter, Steve the dog became Brian, and the Griffin family of Quahog, Rhode Island walked into American living rooms during the highest-rated television event of the year. The show did not stay there. Ratings dropped quickly. Fox moved Family Guy around the schedule, which is what networks do when they have stopped believing in something but have not yet decided to let it go. The show got pulled from the air during its 2nd season because of declining numbers. It came back. It got canceled again in 2002 after the 3rd season ended. By every standard measure of how television works, Family Guy was over. The writers had moved on, the voice cast had moved on, Seth MacFarlane was working on what was supposed to be his next show. 3 things happened next that nobody expected, and the entire history of adult animation in the 2000s and 2010s flows directly out of those 3 things. So before naming a single ripoff, those 3 things have to be put on the table. The first thing was Adult Swim. Cartoon Network had launched its late-night programming block for grown-ups in 2001, aimed at the kind of viewer who was awake at midnight and wanted something funnier and weirder than what the broadcast networks were offering. Adult Swim picked up Family Guy reruns starting in April 2003, slotted them in late at night, and watched what happened. What happened was that Family Guy immediately became the highest-rated show on the entire block. Viewership in that time slot went up by more than 200%. People who had never watched the show during its original run on Fox were finding it for the first time at 1 in the morning, recommending it to their friends, and showing up the next night for more. The second thing was DVD sales. The 1st and 2nd seasons of Family Guy were released on DVD the same week the Adult Swim reruns started, which was either a miracle of timing or the smartest piece of marketing of the decade. Within a single month, that DVD set sold 400,000 copies. By the end of the year, it had sold over 2 million. That made it the best-selling television DVD release of 2003, and the 2nd best-selling television DVD ever made up to that point. Only the 1st season of Chappelle's Show had sold more. The 3rd season DVD release, which came later, sold over 1 million copies on its own. The 3rd thing was the math that those numbers did to Fox's executives. A show they had canceled was now outselling shows they had on the air. A show they had given up on was the most watched program on a competing network's overnight block. The DVDs alone were generating more revenue than most of the new shows on the Fox schedule. So in May 2004, Fox did something that had never been done before in the history of American television. They ordered new episodes of a show specifically because of how well its old episodes were selling on DVD. 35 new episodes. Family Guy was coming back not because the network wanted it back, but because the audience had refused to let it go. Those new episodes started airing on May 1st, 2005. That date matters more than almost any other date in this video. May 1st, 2005 was the launch night of Animation Domination, Fox's new Sunday evening block dedicated entirely to adult animated comedy. Family Guy came back that night. American Dad, MacFarlane's 2nd show, premiered that night. The Simpsons was already there. King of the Hill was already there. For the first time, an entire primetime block on a major broadcast network was given over to grown-up cartoons, and the whole structure had been built around the surprise return of a show that was supposed to be dead. This is the part that most people do not realize about the next 15 years of cartoon history. Animation domination was not a programming experiment. It was a money printing machine. Family Guy in particular became something Fox had never had before, which was an adult cartoon that pulled in the 18 to 49-year-old viewer that advertisers paid the most to reach, and pulled them in week after week in numbers that could compete with any live-action sitcom on television. The show was a hit. The block was a hit. The DVDs kept selling. The merchandise kept selling. Stewie Griffin appeared on lunchboxes and t-shirts and dorm room posters from coast to coast. And every other network in the business looked at that and asked the same question: how do we get one of those? This is where the gold rush starts. Because once animation domination proved that adult animation could be a serious business, every executive at every network with a development budget started looking for their own version. Some of them looked for their own Family Guy. Some of them looked for their own Seth MacFarlane. Some of them simply tried to copy the formula and hoped that the audience would not notice the difference. The next several years would produce more new adult animated sitcoms than any comparable stretch of time in American television history, and most of them would fail. But before anyone failed, the formula itself had to be understood, because if you cannot name what you are copying, you cannot copy it. So what exactly was Family Guy doing that made it so reliable as a hit? 3 things, and these 3 things will come up in every single section of this video, so they are worth knowing now. The first thing was the cutaway gag. Family Guy did not invent the cutaway. The technique had existed in sketch comedy for decades, and shows like The Simpsons had used flashbacks for jokes since the late 80s. What Family Guy did was make the cutaway gag the engine of the entire show, rather than an occasional spice. A typical episode of Family Guy will pause its main story dozens of times to cut away to an unrelated joke. Peter mentions that something is the worst thing that ever happened to him, and the show cuts away to a 30-second sketch about a different bad thing that happened. Brian uses a phrase, and the show cuts away to act out what that phrase reminds the writers of. The plot of any given Family Guy episode is closer to a clothesline that the cutaway gags hang from than it is to a story being told. Once you notice this structure, you cannot unsee it. The second thing was the dysfunctional family setup. Father, mother, 3 kids, weird pet. Working class, suburban setting. Father is a buffoon. Mother is patient and capable. The kids are each one note pushed to an extreme. The Simpsons had built that template 17 years earlier, but Family Guy turned the dial up. Peter Griffin was louder, dumber, more selfish, and more cartoonishly built than Homer Simpson had ever been. The show kept the comforting outline of the family sitcom while filling it with characters who would have been impossible on any earlier version of that genre. That gave the show a structural safety net. No matter how strange a given episode got, the audience always knew where they were. They were in the Griffin living room. The dad was on the couch, the dog was nearby. The third thing was permission. Family Guy granted itself permission to make jokes about subjects that other shows on broadcast television would not touch: religion, race, sex, disability, death. The show treated nothing as off limits, and the cutaway gag structure gave it cover. A joke that landed badly could simply be left behind. The next cutaway was 30 seconds away. Whatever discomfort the audience felt with one moment was overwritten by the momentum of the next moment. This is a real and under-discussed feature of how the show works. The format itself is forgiving in a way that most television formats are not. Cutaway gag, dysfunctional family, permission to go anywhere. That is the whole machine. And once animation domination proved that the machine made money, every other network started building copies of it. The first wave came from inside the house. Seth MacFarlane himself spun off The Cleveland Show in 2009, taking a beloved supporting character from Family Guy and giving him his own series. Other Family Guy writers started developing their own shows under the Fox umbrella. Alan Gregory arrived in 2011 with a Family Guy showrunner attached. Bordertown arrived in 2016 with a Family Guy writer at the helm. Each of these would aim for the same Sunday evening audience that Family Guy had built, and each of these would have its own particular relationship to the formula. The second wave came from outside Fox. Comedy Central wanted its own Family Guy. ABC wanted its own Family Guy. Even networks in other countries wanted their own Family Guy. Comedy Central got Brickleberry in 2012 after Fox had passed on the same pilot in 2007 for being too offensive. Canadian network Teletoon got Crash Canyon in 2011, a show so openly modeled on the cutaway gag formula that even fans of the show admitted it was distracting. Mitchell Hurwitz, the creator of Arrested Development, brought Sit Down, Shut Up to Fox in 2009, hoping to ride the same wave, and watched it get pulled from the schedule after only 4 episodes aired. The third wave was the streaming era. By the late 2000s, broadcast television was no longer the natural home for new adult animation. Netflix had money to spend and no real history of producing animated comedy. comedy. So the same creators who had built and lost Brickleberry on Comedy Central walked across the street and pitched Paradise PD, which premiered on Netflix in 2018, used most of the same voice cast, and copied its own predecessor so faithfully that the two shows eventually did a crossover episode about how similar they were. These shows were not all the same. Some of them were spin-offs, some of them were honest copies, some of them were trying to do something genuinely different and just got swept into the same critical bucket because they happened to be cartoons aimed at adults during the same 15-year stretch. The job of this video is to walk through every single one of them and figure out which is which shows actually deserve to be called ripoffs, which shows just got smeared by association, which shows tried to copy the formula and crashed on takeoff, which shows tried to copy the formula and got away with it for a while, and what the entire wave, taken together, can teach us about the strange decade and a half when American adult animation tried to mass produce itself and mostly could not. One number worth holding in your head as a kind of background sound while we go through this. Family Guy is, as of right now, in its 23rd season. It is approaching its 450th episode. It has been canceled twice and survived both times. It has outlasted every single one of its imitators with a single exception, and that exception is American Dad, which was made by the same person. Every other show in this video is gone. Some of them lasted 1 season. Some of them lasted 4. One of them was scrubbed so completely from the internet after its cancellation that the network removed it from its own website. Most of them have a Rotten Tomatoes score in the low double digits and a Metacritic average that suggests the critics did not just dislike them, but were almost personally offended by them. They aired, they got pulled, the actors moved on, the studios moved on, the audiences forgot. And here we are, years later, ready to fall asleep to all of them in one long, gentle, comprehensive sweep. There is no malice in this. The shows that failed were, almost all of them, made by people who genuinely believed they had something to offer. Some of them were ahead of their time. Some of them were behind their time. Some of them were exactly on time and just bad. The point of going through them is not to laugh at the corpses. The point is to understand the shape of an industry that, for 15 years, kept trying to bottle the same lightning and kept getting empty bottles. The story of Family Guy itself is, in a quiet way, the story of how lightning bottles itself. Cancelled, revived, kept on the air past the point where most shows have any business being on the air, still drawing audiences, still selling DVDs back when DVDs existed, still moving merchandise, still showing up in lunchroom impressions of Stewie. Whatever the show is doing, it is doing something that the imitators could not. The shape of that something is what we are going to spend the next several hours circling. By the end, the question will not be why so many of these shows failed. The question will be why Family Guy alone kept working, and what that says about the formula everyone else thought they were copying. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Before any of that, though, we need to start with the most successful imitation in the entire wave, and the only one of McFarlane's own follow-ups that is still on the air today. The interesting thing about it is that it had every reason to be the most direct copy of all, and instead became the one show that figured out how to be different on purpose. Section 2, American Dad, 2005, Fox/TBS. The ripoff that refused to be one. Here is something almost nobody outside of television history nerds knows. American Dad premiered on the exact same night that Family Guy came back from the dead, February 6th, 2005, Super Bowl Sunday. Fox aired the special preview pilot of American Dad as the lead-out program after the game, putting it in the single most watched television slot of the entire year. 3 months later, on May 1st, 2005, both Family Guy and American Dad launched their full seasons together as part of the brand new Animation Domination block. Same network, same creator, same animation studio, same Sunday night, same demographic. Same pitch in the trade papers, which essentially read, "Seth MacFarlane has another one for you." By every reasonable expectation, American Dad should have been the first and most obvious Family Guy ripoff in history. The setup was suspicious enough on its own. A loud, opinionated father at the head of a suburban family, a patient, capable wife, 2 kids who were each one note pushed to an extreme, a weird, non-human family member living in the house, capable of speaking and getting into trouble. If you held the 2 character sheets next to each other and squinted, the only differences seemed to be that Stan Smith wore a suit instead of a polo shirt, that the family lived in Virginia instead of Rhode Island, and that the talking dog had been swapped out for a talking alien named Roger, and a goldfish with a German man's brain inside it named Klaus. The early reviews picked up on this immediately. Critics in 2005 looked at American Dad and called it Family Guy with a flag pin. The internet of the day made the same joke in 1,000 different ways. Some viewers refused to watch the show on principle, treating it as a cynical attempt by Fox to double up on the same formula now that the formula was finally working. Even MacFarlane himself, in early interviews, admitted that the show had been pitched and developed during a period when he was still mostly thinking the way he had been thinking when he made Family Guy. The early episodes show that thinking. Cutaway gags appear, Stan and Peter share certain mannerisms, the animation pipeline was the same, the voice acting style was the same. For about half of the first season, American Dad genuinely was a Family Guy ripoff. And then something changed. The story of how American Dad became the only one of MacFarlane's shows to outlast the cutaway gag era is one of the most interesting quiet stories in modern American animation, and it has almost never been told properly. The change did not come from MacFarlane himself. MacFarlane co-created American Dad with two writers named Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman, both of whom had come up through Family Guy and had been waiting for a chance to run their own show. By the second season, MacFarlane had started pulling back from the day-to-day work of American Dad to focus on Family Guy and the eventual launch of the Cleveland show. Barker and Weitzman were left alone in the writer's room, and what they decided to do with that freedom was, season by season, walk the show in a completely different direction from anything Family Guy was doing. The first big decision was to abandon the cutaway gag. This is genuinely radical when you think about it. The cutaway gag was the engine of the entire animation domination wave. Every executive at every network believed that the cutaway was the secret of the formula. The cutaway was what made Family Guy feel different from The Simpsons. The cutaway was what made the show fast and dense and quotable. Walking away from the cutaway was, in 2006, like a band that had just had a hit single deciding to release an entirely instrumental album as their follow-up. The Barker and Weitzman writers' room did it anyway. By around the third season, the cutaway gags in American Dad had become rare, and by the fifth season, they had essentially disappeared from the show entirely. What replaced the cutaway was character. American Dad started running long jokes that paid off across an entire episode, rather than 30-second jokes that paid off and disappeared. The show began building actual continuity. Things that happened in one episode would still be true in the next episode. Characters changed. Roger, the alien, started developing a roster of personas that the writers tracked as a kind of running bit, with each persona having its own clothing, voice, vocabulary, and history. By the time the show was a few seasons in, Roger had over 100 named alter egos, and the show treated them as if they were real characters who lived inside one body. This is the kind of decision that breaks most cartoon shows. Continuity is dangerous. It means every new viewer needs to catch up on 100 small references before a given joke makes sense. It means the writer's room has to remember everything they did before. It means the show stops being something a casual viewer can drop into in the middle and immediately understand. American Dad made all of those bets, and, against every prediction in the industry, the show kept getting funnier as it leaned into them. The other big decision was to let the show get strange. Where Family Guy used its cutaway structure to do 100 little jokes per episode, American Dad started doing one big premise per episode and committing to it completely. An episode of American Dad might begin with Stan trying to get a parking spot at the mall and end, 22 minutes later, with Stan having faked his own death, started a new family in another country, and accidentally caused a small war. The show treated its premises as roller coasters that you got on at the start and rode all the way to wherever the writers had decided to crash them. Several episodes from the show's middle seasons are now considered among the best individual episodes any adult animated show has ever produced. Tearjerker, which was a full James Bond parody, The Vacation Goo, which revealed that an entire season of family vacation memories had been computer-generated implants, Rapture's Delight, an episode about the Christian apocalypse that committed so completely to its premise that the entire family ended up living in a post-apocalyptic wasteland for most of the runtime. None of these episodes could have been made on Family Guy. Family Guy is structurally incapable of committing to a premise for that long, because the cutaway gag is always pulling the show off the road. American Dad, by walking away from that engine, found space for a kind of long-form animated comedy that nobody else on Sunday night was doing. The audience noticed, not loudly, and not all at once, but steadily. American Dad never had the cultural footprint of Family Guy. There was no merchandise tidal wave. Stan Smith never appeared on a million dorm room posters. Roger never became a meme on the level of Stewie. But the show kept its audience season after season, kept its quality high while Family Guy started receiving receiving criticism for declining writing and kept getting renewed. Then, in 2014, something happened that would have killed almost any other show. Fox decided to pull American Dad out of the animation domination block. The block was being restructured. The network wanted live-action comedies in the Sunday slot, and American Dad, despite its consistent quality, was the show chosen to be moved off broadcast television. The series was sent to TBS, the basic cable channel, where it began its 11th season in the fall of 2014. For most adult cartoons, getting moved from network to basic cable is the long, slow goodbye. The audience scatters, the budget shrinks, the press coverage stops, new episodes air with no fanfare, and the show quietly ends a few seasons later, mostly forgotten. American Dad did the opposite. The show went to TBS and got better. The basic cable rules were looser than the broadcast rules, which meant the writers could swear more, push violence further, and take stranger swings than they had been allowed to take on Fox. The show kept its existing fan base, picked up new viewers who only watched cable, and ran on TBS for 10 straight years. Through 2024, American Dad continued producing new episodes, while almost every other show in this video had been canceled, forgotten, scrubbed from the internet, or both. In March 2025, Fox announced that American Dad was coming back home. The show would return to broadcast television in 2026 to begin its 22nd season, airing on Animation Domination alongside The Simpsons, Family Guy, and Bob's Burgers. The show is also already locked in through season 25, which would put it at over 400 episodes by the time it concludes. To put that in plain terms, American Dad has now been on the air for over 2 decades, has produced more episodes than most live-action sitcoms in television history, and is currently outlasting almost every show that ever tried to copy its older sibling. This is the part that matters for the larger story this video is telling. Every show in this video is, in some way, a response to Family Guy. American Dad's response was the strangest one of all, because the response was, do not be Family Guy. Do not use the cutaway gag. Do not depend on shock for its own sake. Do not treat the family as a clothesline for unrelated jokes. Build characters who can carry a story. Build stories that can carry a season. Build a show that an audience can actually live inside, rather than briefly visit. That is the lesson that none of the shows that came later seemed willing to learn. Most of the imitators that arrived after American Dad doubled down on the cutaway gag, the shock humor, and the loose plot structure, on the theory that those were the elements that made Family Guy work. American Dad had quietly proven, in real time, that the elements that made Family Guy work were also the elements that put a ceiling on how long Family Guy could keep working at full strength. By stepping away from those elements, American Dad found a kind of staying power that nothing else in the wave was able to find. There is a cost to this approach worth being honest about. American Dad is not as quotable as Family Guy. There is no American Dad equivalent of the Bird is the Word episode, or the Surfin' Bird musical number that lives in millions of phone memes. The show's strength is that you have to watch it in order with the previous episodes in your head to get the full effect. That is why it never became a phenomenon in the way that Family Guy did. Phenomena need surface energy. American Dad has depth instead. The trade is real, and the show made it on purpose. Critics over the years have noticed this. Reviews of American Dad's later seasons consistently note that the show has become more experimental, more willing to take big swings on individual episodes, and more emotionally invested in its own characters than its supposed older sibling. Stan Smith, by the show's later seasons, is no longer the loud, one-note conservative father he started as in 2005. He has been given an inner life. His relationship with Roger has been treated episode by episode as one of the strangest and most genuine friendships in animated television history. Steve, the son, has been allowed to fail and grow in ways that Chris Griffin on Family Guy has never been allowed to fail or grow. Haley, the daughter, has aged on screen, married, had a kid, and changed her politics over the course of the show's run. None of that sounds like the description of a show that started life as a Family Guy ripoff. That is exactly the point. What American Dad teaches the rest of this video is something most viewers will not have considered. The shows that came later, the ones that got canceled after 1 season or 3, the ones that had to be scrubbed from streaming services, the ones nobody remembers anymore, all believed that copying Family Guy meant copying its surface. They copied the cutaway gag. They copied the dysfunctional family setup. They copied the willingness to push past good taste, and almost none of them survived. American Dad copied the surface for about half a season and then walked away from it. And 21 years later, it is still on the air. The implication of that is heavier than it sounds at first. If American Dad survived by not being Family Guy, then maybe what made Family Guy survive was not the cutaway gag, the dysfunctional family or the permission to go anywhere. Maybe those were the symptoms, not the cause. Maybe the actual cause was something nobody managed to copy because nobody could see it clearly enough to know what it was. That is a question this video is going to keep coming back to in different ways with every show that follows. Each failed imitator will be in its own way evidence about what the real secret was. For now, the headline is simple. The first show to come out of McFarlane's office after Family Guy returned was the one show in the entire wave that figured out how to last. It did so by being the most disobedient ripoff in the history of the format. Everything that followed could have learned from that. Almost nothing did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Which brings us to the show that did exactly the opposite of American Dad. The show that took a single beloved Family Guy character, walked him out of Quahog, dropped him into a new town, and tried to recreate the cutaway gag formula one for one with a different family wrapped around it. That show was the one that taught Fox a hard lesson about whether you can clone the same machine twice and expect both copies to keep running. Section 3, The Cleveland Show, 2009 to 2013, Fox. The spin-off that got called Family Guy in blackface. The pitch should have worked. Cleveland Brown had been part of Family Guy from the beginning. He was one of Peter Griffin's 3 best friends, alongside Joe Swanson and Glenn Quagmire, and he sat next to Peter at the Drunken Clam every week the way friends sit next to each other in real bars in real towns. He had a gentle voice. He had a slow, friendly way of talking that made him sound like the calmest man in any room, which was funny because the room he was usually in contained Peter Griffin. He had a long-running gag where his bathtub would burst through the side of his house and slide him down the street, naked and surprised, while a tinkling piano played in the background. By the late 2000s, Cleveland was one of the most well-liked characters on the entire show. The fan base had warmed to him in a way they had not warmed to most of the sidecast. So in 2007, Seth MacFarlane started thinking about giving Cleveland his own show. The reasoning made sense at the level of a business meeting. Family Guy was now a hit, American Dad was working, Animation Domination was the most reliable Sunday night programming block on broadcast television. A third MacFarlane show in the same lineup would mean 3 hours of Sunday programming under his name, 3 streams of merchandise revenue, 3 syndication libraries piling up over time. King of the Hill, the long-running Mike Judge show that had been holding down the 8:30 slot since 1997, was approaching its end. Fox needed something to fill that hole. A Family Guy spin-off was the obvious answer, and Cleveland was the obvious character to spin off. The show appeared on Fox's development slate in early 2008. By June 2009, the network had announced that The Cleveland Show would premiere that fall. The pilot was leaked online ahead of time, a leak that some sources at the time suggested was deliberate, since the reaction to the leak was strong enough that Fox renewed the show for a second season before the first episode had even aired on television. That is an unusual move. Renewing a show before the audience has seen a single broadcast is the kind of confidence networks usually only have when they think they cannot lose. The Cleveland Show premiered September 27th, 2009. The setup moved Cleveland out of Quahog, Rhode Island, and back to his hometown in Stoolbend, Virginia. He left Family Guy at the end of the previous season, told Quagmire he was getting a spin-off, and walked off into his own theme song. In Stoolbend, Cleveland reunited with Donna, an old high school flame, and married her. Donna came with 2 kids of her own, a teenage daughter named Roberta, and a 5-year-old son named Rollo. Cleveland brought along his own son, Cleveland Jr., who in Family Guy had been a small, energetic, average-sized child. For the spin-off, Cleveland Jr. was redesigned as an obese, soft-spoken, gentle teenager. He looked nothing like he had on The Parent Show. The original voice actor, Mike Henry, kept voicing Cleveland and Rollo, but Cleveland Jr. was handed off to Kevin Michael Richardson, who gave the character a completely different voice and energy. The supporting cast included a talking bear named Tim, voiced for the first season by Seth MacFarlane himself, who lived next door and acted as Cleveland's new friend in the way Quagmire had been Cleveland's friend in Family Guy. There were 2 redneck brothers named Lester and Holt, who served as the new local barflies. There was a sad-faced bartender named Gus, played by David Lynch, the legendary film director, in one of the strangest casting choices in the entire run of Animation Domination. Lynch stayed with the show for years, voicing every appearance of Gus, and almost nobody who watched the show casually realized that one of the most acclaimed living American filmmakers was doing voice work on a Sunday night cartoon. Reviews were mixed from day one. Rotten Tomatoes recorded a 44% approval rating for the first season. Some critics were generous. Rob Owen of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette wrote that the show was as rude and crude as Family Guy, but had more warmth because Cleveland was a more likable lead character than Peter Peter Griffin. Owen praised the talking bear character, calling Tim by far the most amusing creation on the show. Other critics were not generous at all. Tom Shales, writing for the Washington Post, gave one of the harshest reviews of MacFarlane's career as a producer, comparing him to a dirty old man hanging around playgrounds with naughty pictures or risque jokes as lures. Roberto Bianco at USA Today wrote that the easiest fix for the show's problems was cancellation. The harshest line came from John McWhorter, the linguist and cultural commentator writing in the New Republic. McWhorter called the Cleveland show a patronizing mess and described it as, basically, Family Guy in blackface. That phrase stuck. It became, for a certain segment of the show's critics, the entire problem with the spinoff, in 7 words. The criticism McWhorter and others were pointing at was specific. Cleveland on Family Guy had been a quiet, calm, gentle man whose comedy came from the contrast between his peaceful voice and the chaos around him. The Cleveland show kept his voice, but surrounded him with a cast of broad, loud, often stereotyped black characters whose comedy came from being broad, loud, and stereotyped. Rollo, the 5-year-old, was written as a tiny, aggressive ladies' man whose voice Mike Henry had originally created decades earlier for prank phone calls. Roberta, the teenage daughter, was sexualized in ways the show treated as a running joke. Lester and Holt, the rednecks, were exactly the kinds of cartoon Southerners that critics had been complaining about in animation for 50 years. The supporting cast leaned heavily on the same kinds of broad humor Family Guy had used, but applied to a black community in a black neighborhood, written by a writer's room that was overwhelmingly white. The show was aware of this criticism. It was aware in the way Family Guy is always aware of criticism, which is to say that it sometimes addressed the issue head-on with a joke, and sometimes ignored it completely. There were episodes that engaged with race in genuinely thoughtful ways. There were episodes that did the exact thing critics were complaining about, with no apparent self-consciousness. The show was trying, in some sense, to be both Family Guy and a sitcom about black American suburban life, and the gears of those two ambitions did not always fit together. The ratings tell the rest of the story plainly. The first season averaged decent numbers thanks to curiosity and the lead-in from Family Guy. By the second season, the audience was already thinning. By the third season, the show was clearly on a slow downward slope. By the fourth season, the writing was on the wall. Industry observers at the time noted that the final 2 seasons of The Cleveland Show may have been ordered specifically to push the episode count past the syndication threshold. In American television, a show generally needs around 88 episodes to be sold profitably as reruns to other networks. The Cleveland Show ended its run on May 19th, 2013, with exactly 88 episodes produced. That number is not a coincidence. That number is the entire reason the show kept getting renewed when its ratings did not justify renewal. Fox kept the spinoff alive long enough to hit the magic syndication number and then ended it. Kevin Riley, the Fox chairman of entertainment, confirmed the cancellation in May 2013. The Cleveland Show became the first MacFarlane-penned show to be canceled with no expectation of revival. Family Guy had been canceled twice and come back. The Cleveland Show was canceled once and stayed gone. What happened next is one of the strangest moves in modern animation history. After the cancellation, MacFarlane announced that Cleveland and his Stoolbend family would be returning to Family Guy, not as guests, as permanent residents. In Family Guy Season 12, in the episode He's Black, the entire Brown Tubbs family moved back to Quahog. Cleveland, Donna, Cleveland Jr., Roberta, and Rallo all relocated into the Brown house next door to the Griffins. The spinoff had simply been folded back into the parent show, the way a failed branch on a family tree gets pruned and the trunk keeps growing. Family Guy itself made jokes about the cancellation. There is an episode of Family Guy called Inside Family Guy, where Cleveland is shown wallowing in shame over his show's cancellation. There is a moment in The Simpsons Guy, the famous Family Guy and Simpsons crossover, where Peter is shown casually carrying Cleveland in his airplane, after Cleveland's plane crash-landed into the ground, a visual joke about the Cleveland show's cancellation and its dependence on the parent series. The show, in other words, ate its own failure as material. The cancellation became a running gag. Cleveland came home, slotted back into the bar at the Drunken Clam, and the Family Guy machine continued. There is a postscript that has to be mentioned because it changes the meaning of the entire spin-off in retrospect. In June 2020, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests following the killing of George Floyd, Mike Henry, the white voice actor who had played Cleveland from the very first Family Guy episode in 1999, announced that he was stepping down from the role. Henry stated publicly that a black character character should be voiced by a black actor, and that he was leaving the role to make room for that to happen. He had voiced Cleveland for over 20 years across both Family Guy and The Cleveland Show. The role has not been formally recast on Family Guy as of 2026, though actor Wendell Pierce has stated publicly that he would be interested in taking over the part. What this means for The Cleveland Show as a project is uncomfortable. The entire run of the spin-off, which was already being criticized in real time for being a show about a black community written by a mostly white writer's room and led by a white voice actor, became, after 2020, a much harder show to defend. Henry's own decision to step down can be read as a quiet acknowledgement that the criticism had been valid all along. The show's full run is still available on Hulu and Disney Plus internationally, but it is rarely discussed in lists of great adult cartoons, and most retrospectives of McFarlane's career mention it as a footnote rather than as a centerpiece. Looking back at the show now, with everything we know, the most accurate description of what The Cleveland Show actually was is something simpler than the harsh contemporary reviews suggested. The Cleveland Show was a Family Guy episode, stretched out for 4 full seasons. The structure was the same, the cutaway gags were the same, the pacing of the jokes was the same, the willingness to push past good taste was the same. The show even reused background characters from the parent series and shared writers and animators with both Family Guy and American Dad. The thing it was trying to do was take the Family Guy machine, paint it a slightly different color, point it at a different community, and run it on the same Sunday night. The machine ran. It just did not run as well. The lesson the network seemed to take from this is the wrong one. Fox concluded, based on the Cleveland Show's modest performance, that the issue was the audience's interest in Cleveland specifically as a lead character. They concluded that the formula had not been the problem, and that a different lead character with a different setup might still produce another long-running hit. That conclusion would lead directly to the next several attempts at McFarlane-adjacent shows on the network, each of which would copy the formula in slightly different ways.
और बताओ यार आज मैं हो गया 3-4 कार्टून का ना कौन हाँ कौन सा गिराऊँ 4 कार्टून का ये भाई 5 का बेटा है 4 का तो आराम से है पर तुमने एक ही दिन में ला दिया मामला सेट सब है रवि गैराज 3 दिन लेंगे 4 दिन लेंगे 5 दिन लेंगे फलाना ढंगा एक हफ्ते बाद आगा हमारे कर लिया ना आपके पास लेकिन तुम्हें जस्ता सही लगता है लोहे का सही लगता है ये लोहे में तुम हल्का भी लगता है क्या गाएगा पुला पोच हो भरा ये वो अब पानी कुछ एक काम करा हुआ क्या हाँ मगर ये पागल लग रहा है इतना महंगा हाँ तो जुगाड़ बनाओ बिना बाजार का चल ना भाई हाँ क्यों ये निकल लिए दो क्या निकल लेंगे क्या निकल लेंगे बात है ला है ना क्या ला बिना बाजार को मजा आएगा ये बिल्कुल बैग के जाएगा ये बहुत बढ़िया रहेगा बिना बाजार के क्या भैया यार मैं तुम कौन में रवि माल दे आ गया और कमी गरीब माल लाया कट्टा ना करवाने नहीं कोई ना आया याद भाई सुन रहे कट्टा नहीं मैं कट्टा पकड़वाने के पूछ रहा था अच्छा कट्टा पकड़वाओगे मैंने कट्टा पकड़वाओगे फिर ने पकड़वाया फिर ने पकड़वाया याद भाई वो लड़का तुझे काम करना है हाँ उन्होंने पकड़वा दिया वो आया के ऊपर ना ऊपर तो थे करके आए ना अच्छा मैं कर गई हूँ आमिर भी आप पूजा ने राम में घुमा दो ना अच्छा अच्छा जैसे पैसों में भी जा करते यार मैं ये कट्टा और कर दो यार तुम कल तो खाली पैक ही नहीं करवाए हमारे पैक बोले जाऊँगा हाँ तो ही पैक हुआ वो भी तो आएंगे ना सुबह कौन फतेह भाई है नहीं भाई फतेह भाई नहीं भाई फतेह भाई तो वही आएंगे अच्छा फतेह भाई ना आएंगे उनकी राहुल आई ना रहा अकाउंट पैसे लेता उससे हैं
जाके पीली ऐसे हो गया तो किटी वाला मार गया।
अच्छा
8 हो गया सारे 5 टांगे आए।
अल्लाह रहम करो।
इनके भैया बता वो होता है
की वे
दोनों पीवे
ना राहुल
ये भी है बाकी दोनों भैया पीवे कोई या तो भैया पीता हो मैं बोल दिया
झूठ बोल रहे हैं।
अब क्या
इंसान की आदत कोई बदल नहीं सकती है, चाहे मैं हूँ या तुम। अच्छा
मैं आपको क्या इंतजार करता खाने का 10 बजे 2 बजे जाता वाला में जा रहा हूँ।
अच्छा ज़्यादा ज़रूरत है पैसों की तुम्हें? ज़्यादा ज़रूरत है ना? ज़रूरत है ज़्यादा?
हाँ पापा को
चलो मैं दे रहा हूँ
पापा के पापा के साथ पैसे
पापा से बाद में लेना। पापा गए मैं दे दूँगा। चलो 100 रुपये पेटीएम में से निकाल के दे रहा हूँ तुम्हें 100 रुपये, ठीक है?
पापा का चाहिए भी आएंगे तो देंगे
और सानू भाई के पैसे हैं मेरे पास, जब भी तो दे रहा हूँ तुम्हें मैं।
पापा का चाहिए फोन पे आके नहीं देंगे
पापा के पैसे ना हैं। अरे एक माल में कटवा देना, सानू भाई के हैं मेरे पास। गए तो वो अरे गए भाई साहब, अभी आए, तुमने देखे ना गेट पे? अभी आए, देख गए हैं वो, गए। वरना बात ही लो मिट्टी जैसे ना
तुमने बताया को ना पापा को दे दो पापा पैसे दे दे
तो पापा से ले लेना। पापा तो कोई अब
पापा दे